I'm here with Dr. Jennifer Marsh, who is a research fellow at P&G Beauty. This presentation is a sponsored fireside chat. Thank you so much to P&G for supporting our e-conference by sponsoring this fireside chat. And we're going to be talking about heat and color protection. Maybe before that, Jennifer, would you mind introducing who you are and what you do?
Yes, well, good morning, and thank you very much for having me. Yes, my name is Jennifer Marsh. I'm a senior technologist at P&G. I've been in the company almost 28 years, and 26 of those working in the beauty care space. I worked for about 12 years in a hair color business, and then the rest of it in hair care. And my interest has always been the fundamental mechanisms that are going on during the processes that the consumer would do. So, what's happening during the coloring process, both in terms of how is she achieving the color, but also what's happening to the hair and then the consequences of that, and heat as well. We've studied that in quite a lot of detail. And then more recently, how do we think about heat and color? Because the consumer obviously is not just coloring, they're not just using heated implements, they're doing a whole variety of things all at once. So, how do these different insults come together? And that's kind of my passion, and that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Well, I'm so happy to have you here for this fireside chat. And maybe it makes sense to start with color. So, how does coloring impact hair structure and properties?
I think first thing about color to think about, you know, what's the impact on the consumer? So I just before you kind of get into the hair structure, I think the emotional benefit of color is huge. Even more so than a shampoo. Shampoo will get my hair clean, which is very important, but color really kind of fits into how the consumer views herself. So either if they want to change their visual appearance to really reflect a different personality, or they want to cover gray. There's lots of different ways, but it is such a compelling category. And really, the achievement of the color is like the number one important thing that the consumer is looking for. So, can I get to that transformation? Either I want to be a blonde, or I want to be a redhead, or I want to cover my gray. And then within that, as I color my hair, really what I'm trying to do is there are two sort of main processes involved in the coloring process. One is to lighten the underlying color, and secondly, to then put on synthetic color. So if I want to go blonde, I'll have a lot of lightening. I want to go from a medium brown shade to a blonde shade. I have to lighten it. And in that, I need to bleach the melanin. So melanin is what gives hair color. I want to lighten that melanin. And typically, hydrogen peroxide at high pH is the technology that's the major technology in most of our hair colorants. So that's one process that's going on. And then simultaneously, I'm taking these small dye precursors, penetrating them into the hair. That same oxidant system of hydrogen peroxide, high pH, is forming the color. So if I want to be red, I've got a combination of lightening the underlying color, and then I use dye precursors that, when coupled together, create that red color. If I want a darker shade, maybe I put in more dye, less lightening. So that's kind of the chemistry that's going on during a hair colorant. But that same chemistry, so the hydrogen peroxide at the high pH, so we have ammonia in most of our coloring products, is also changing the hair structure. And most of most of the changes are not being driven by the dyes, the color molecules, but more by this lightening chemistry. So how do I change the melanin color? So the hydrogen peroxide, high pH, that's the chemistry that's having the major impact on the hair structure. And there's multiple chemistries going on, but the major ones to think about. The first one is the removal of the surface lipid on the outside of hair. So that's what gives hair its soft feel. There's a bound lipid on the outside of each cuticle layer on the hair surface. In the presence of the high peroxide, high pH of a colorant, that lipid can be removed. So you form perhydroxyl anions, and then they remove that lipid layer. So you go from a very hydrophobic surface to a hydrophilic surface. If you take natural hair that hasn't been colored, you put a drop of water on the hair surface, the drop of water just kind of beads on the hair surface. As soon as that lipid layer is removed, you get this very hydrophilic surface, and that water sort of immediately wicks in. And so what the consumer will feel is after coloring, particularly when the hair is wet, it's difficult to detangle, so it's easy to tangle. It feels slightly rougher. It takes longer to dry. And then also in the dry, it may not be so shiny and aligned because, again, you've changed that surface layer. So that's kind of one important sort of process that goes on. That same chemistry is also changing the internal structure of the hair. So we know that hair is got keratin proteins. Keratin proteins that have disulfide bond linkages that make the hair very strong. Those linkages can start getting broken down by that same chemistry. So the other consequence is the hair tends to get weaker, and it's particularly weaker when it's wet. So again, you're changing the internal structure, you're breaking down the proteins, you are also changing the lipids, but all that chemistry is going on inside the hair, and then you have this surface change of the lipid removal. In the consumer's mind, that's all worth it because I'm getting the color that I want. So I think that's always the thing to remember. The most important thing that the consumer is looking for when she's coloring is that transformation. And then she's often willing to deal with the consequences of that and using the right products, etc., to minimize the changes in the hair structure. But ultimately, the transformation is the most important thing.
Now, you've talked a lot about the damaging impacts that coloring your hair has. And if you, as a listener, listen to Trevor Evans' presentation, a lot of this will kind of ring a bell from what he was talking about earlier in the summit. Is there anything additional that, when we're thinking about damaging effects and their extents, that hair faces with coloring, or maybe other things that might impact damage to colored hair that consumers should be thinking about?
The other thing that we found was the importance of the water that you use, so that we have seen additional damage in the presence of metals that it picks up from the water. So copper, for example. So as the hair gets more damaged, it will start to pick up calcium and magnesium water hardness from the water, but also low levels of copper. And then as you color it, you can accelerate that damage. So again, there are other mechanisms by which the hair can get damaged during coloring. I think the other thing is frequency of coloring and how the coloring is done. So the more frequent you're coloring, all of that damage is going to accumulate over time. So towards the tips of your hair, you tend to have more damage than the roots. So what consumers might see is a variation in their hair quality from root to tip as they're coloring more frequently. One of the studies we did just recently where we were tracking consumers, even a year after they had colored, they colored a year ago, you could still see the damage on the tips of their hair because that damage was still there. They had fairly long hair. So people think that the impacts of coloring are immediate, but actually, you'll still see the consequences of them until you cut the hair.
And now, before we move on to heat damage, I'm sure what everyone is wondering right now listening to this, what works to protect hair from color damage? And this can include practices, ingredients, or maybe product forms.
If you're changing the surface of which you are changing the surface of your hair and making it more difficult to comb, etc., more tangles, that's kind of why the conditioning agents, leave-on treatments that are going to lubricate the hair have a huge impact and are really important for those consumers, particularly in that wet state. I think that's the most important time that you need to make sure you got really good conditioning. So you either using a rinse-off conditioner or even using a rinse-off and then a leave-on when the hair is still wet, because that's where you tend to get most of the tangles. And then also that's when the hair is weakest because it's more elastic, it's more easy to break. So I think that's one of the key places that you would intervene by making sure you're using the good quality conditioners. Also kind of making sure if we do have products and we sell them where we have chelants in the shampoo to remove any of those redox copper metals, etc., that may accelerate damage. You can do a pre-treatments before coloring to kind of make sure you don't have any of that damage. In terms of habits, coloring frequency is going to be important. And then also thinking about the more damage you tend to get depends on the transformation. So that's just something to bear in mind. So the more I'm transforming my color, the more coloring damage I'm likely to see. So if I'm going from dark brown to a medium brown, you're going to get less damage than if I'm going dark brown to a blonde. So, just kind of bear that in mind as you're thinking about the transformation that you want to go through.
Then flipping over to heat, and there's a lot to that as well. So, how does heat impact hair structure and properties?
So I think if you think about, first of all, like the different types of heat, and they are different in terms of the impact they have. So I think about a blow dryer, kind of the most, probably the commonest used way of using heat. During most of that blow drying process, your hair doesn't get hot. So when the hair is wet, and then as it dries, that first part of the process, your hair doesn't get very warm because what's happening is that you're using the heat to get absorbed by the water and then evaporate the water. So that's kind of where all that energy is going. And really what's important there is if I'm doing a lot of combing when my hair is wet, in that wet state, then you might just start to see tangles forming, breakage, etc. So it's not really a consequence of the heat itself. It's just you're manipulating the hair when it's wet. And as I remember, I said, like where hair is at its weakest is when it's wet. So I think just being careful during that first process when the hair is wet, as you're blow drying, then eventually you're going to get to a point where the hair is dry and you're starting to create the style. That's when the hair can start to get warm. In a blow dryer, you can probably get to 80 degrees C. So I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit. Sorry, I'm European, so I don't think in Fahrenheit, but about 80 degrees C. You can see a little bit of changes in the proteins and sometimes some just breakage of the cuticles, but that's not a major damage. I think most of the heat itself damage comes when you start to use flat irons and curling irons. When you increase that temperature to be in that 200 degrees C, so like 370 degrees Fahrenheit. So when I'm using the flat irons, because now I'm getting into a much higher temperature, the hair is getting much hotter. Now I can start to see changes in my proteins. And what we've seen from our research is that there's kind of a trigger point of about 190 degrees C to 375 Fahrenheit, where you can start to degrade the protein structure. So if you heat hair very warm, eventually it'll just kind of melt and all of that protein structure will break down. But you can even start to see protein degradation, breaking of the disulfide bonds, breaking of the peptide bonds at that trigger point of about 190. So nothing much happens. You get to that trigger point and suddenly the damage goes up. So I think that's kind of, as you're trying to minimize that damage, awareness of that temperature and just trying to kind of keep below that. And most flat irons will get you into that temperature range if you put them on the highest setting.
Now, I wonder if this is a misconception that we can debunk. This idea that hair dryers are inherently damaging. Now, it seems like there's a benefit here. As mentioned, when your hair is wet, it's the most prone to damage. And there's a point with heat where it's like a trigger point where damage starts to happen. So, with low heat and drying, could that actually be protective rather than, for example, sleeping with wet hair? What do you think?
I don't think for me at least, I don't think it's majorly damaging to use a blow dryer if you use it correctly. I'm not sure that it would be better for you than sleeping with wet hair, but I think making sure when it's wet, you're drying off that excess water. I don't think there's a lot of damage in that, as long as you're not kind of detangling and forming tangles and breaking it at that point. If you're just kind of using it and maybe not using a brush, but just getting rid of the excess water, I don't think there's much going on to the hair structure during that phase. It's when it starts to get really dry and you're using heat on that dry hair, that's the kind of the critical point where the heat damage will occur.
Moving on to, I'm sure everyone is now wondering, yeah, how do we protect our hair from heat damage? So, what are some practices, ingredients, or product forms that users should be thinking about or using?
So I think there are, again, two major ones I would talk about to protect yourself from heat damage. So certainly, if you're just using blow dryers, again, manipulation of hair when it's wet, that's when it's at its most fragile. So again, any products that are going to help reduce tangles forming, any sort of brushing force that you need to take to get that comb or brush through the hair. Anything will reduce that force is going to be a good thing. So that's the kind of first thing. So products that you put on before you blow dry, heat protection products usually have some lubricating ingredients in there to reduce those tangles. So that's the first thing. And then I think as the hair gets really dry and you're trying to manipulate that dry hair, just kind of be a bit cautious about how long you do that and how detailed you do that, particularly if you're using flat irons. Like it's better to do more passes, but at a lower temperature than trying to get to really cranking the temperature up and trying to get everything done in like one or two passes. So lower temperature is better, and particularly trying to keep down, not the very highest setting, but maybe setting 3 or so on your flat iron as a maximum. And then kind of what we found is that you could get to higher temperatures on your hair, particularly if you were taking very small amounts of the hair and kind of doing it, really gripping the flat iron, going slowly through the hair. All of those contributed to more damage. So just kind of be cautious about the technique that you use. The slower you're going, the more the hair will heat up and get to that critical temperature versus kind of passing through a little quicker, but you just maybe need more passes. Heat protection products that go on right before you flat iron can be very helpful, and particularly lubricating ingredients like silicones. And some of the silicone will absorb some of that heat, but also one of its major properties will be just to make sure that you're not kind of slowing down and creating hot spots in the hair. So because it lubricates the hair, you can easily pass the flat iron through it. And by doing that, you don't get it to that high temperature and you'll help protect it. And also it'll help absorb some of that heat. So again, it's all about trying not to get to that high temperature.
And now we've talked about color and we've talked about heat, but now what happens when heat and color damage combines? So what happens to the hair and what works to protect the hair from the combined impact?
When you talk about color, one of the important things is now I've broken some of that bonds and it's weaker in that wet state. So then it's even more important when you're using blow dryer to be careful in using these products, for example, with silicones that will reduce friction during combing and styling. So it's important for everyone, but it's even more important for people who color because their hair is inherently weaker and will be more easily tangled and will be easier to break. And the same is true with the flat irons, kind of making sure that you've not got the really super high temperature. And again, you're using lubricating products. The other thing that we found in kind of more recent research is that there is some chemistry that you create during the coloring process that will create species that then when you heat, you can start to form additional damage. So that we have seen some synergistic damage between coloring and flat ironing particularly. So again, I would, if I was coloring, yes, there are products that can help you, but also just kind of limiting or reducing the amount of the heat that you use is also going to be a good thing.
And so we've been talking for a little while, and to start wrapping up our conversation, do you have any final take homes that you'd want to leave our audience with? And or are there any nuggets of information that we haven't had a chance to cover, but you think are important to the topic?
One major thing is that the benefit of coloring and using heat to create the style are super important for the amount of transformation that the consumer is going to see. So I think the idea of saying don't color, don't use heat doesn't help, because I think that's really what the consumer is wanting. They want that level of transformation. It's all about understanding how can I achieve that transformation but still protect my hair as much as possible to give myself the look that I want. For me, the secret is using good quality products, particularly in that wet phase is one major area that I would say is like, how do I get good lubrication and good protection during the wet stage as I come out of the shower, either a leave-on or a good rinse-off treatment? How do I use products that will minimize the uptake of these metals to keep it in the good state? So then when I brush and comb and use the heat, I can minimize the amount of stress that I put on the hair and minimize the amount of damage. And then I think the other major thing is if flat irons are great and they can really give transformation and the hair looks healthy, it looks shiny, etc. It's just kind of how do I moderate that temperature and really try not to go above that critical sort of 370, 190 degrees C temperature. I think those would be the major things that I would think about. If you do that, you can still color, still use heat, and still have really great, healthy looking hair.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I learned so much from this presentation. I don't know that much about hair science. So, this whole conference, I've been learning a lot. So, thank you so much, Jennifer, for agreeing to this pocket talk. And again, thank you to Procter and Gamble for continuing to support the SciComm work we do, including by sponsoring this pocket talk.